Could the Transatlantic alliance fall apart? Many EU leaders have rejected the US Vice President's criticism of democracy on the continent. JD Vance called into question how their countries are governed. So, can Europe still count on Washington? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian. Finighan. A rift appears to be developing between Europe and its longtime ally, the United States. US Vice President JD Vance stunned delegates at the security conference in Munich when he lectured Europe on what he described as its retreat from free speech and shared values. His comments have been widely denounced as meddlesome and unacceptable. So where does this leave transatlantic relations built up over decades after World War II? And how can Europe respond to a reversal of Washington's isolationist stance towards Russia? We'll get to those questions in a moment. But first, a report from Michael Apple.
When US Vice President JD Vance took the podium at the Munich Security Conference, he joked.
I hope that's not the last bit of applause that I get, but we gather...
It was. He struck a combative tone in a speech watched by stony-faced European leaders and military brass. Their enemy, he told them, wasn't Russia or China.
What I worry about is the threat from within, the retreat of Europe from some of its most fundamental values, values shared with the United States of America.
He took a swipe at mainstream German political parties who refused to work with the Alternative for Germany party because of its far-right anti-immigration policies, and even accused European leaders of silencing their critics.
Now, to many of us on the other side of the Atlantic, it looks more and more like old entrenched interests hiding behind ugly Soviet-era words like misinformation and disinformation.
From the leader of Europe's largest economy and the second biggest contributor to NATO, unequivocal rejection of Vance's comments on the state of democracy in Europe.
Das gehört sich nicht. That's just not done. Certainly not amongst friends and allies. We resolutely reject this. Where our democracy goes from here is for us to decide.
Germany's defense minister also took exception to the vice president's remarks.
If I understood him correctly, he compared conditions in parts of Europe with those in authoritarian regimes. Ladies and gentlemen, that's not acceptable.
Across the Atlantic, the man whom Vance had represented in Munich was full of praise.
I thought he made a very good speech, actually, a very brilliant speech. Yeah. Europe has to be careful.
Thank you all. Good luck to all of you.
A speech that has set in motion the fracturing of a decades-old alliance that could well be on the brink of collapse. Michael Apple, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests. Joining us from the German capital is Jessica Berlin, a non-resident senior fellow at the Transatlantic Defense and Security Program at the Center for European Policy Analysis. In Washington, D.C. is Benjamin Friedman, the policy director at the American foreign policy think tank Defense Priorities. And also in Berlin is Olaf Boehnke, the Germany director for Rasmussen Global, a geopolitical advisory firm. Warm welcome to you all. Olaf, let's start with you. You were in the overflow room in Munich, along with some pretty high-profile attendees. What was the reaction to the speech, both during and afterwards? What were delegates saying about it?
Foremost, everyone was... So most of the people were quite confused. So because everyone expected Vice President Vance to talk about Ukraine, about security. Even the chairman of the Munich Security Conference announced on public radio earlier the morning he's expecting the Vice President to announce that the US will withdraw troops from Europe and so on. And then he didn't touch upon foreign policy at all. So you could see literally in the room that people were looking from right to left and wondering, so what's happening? What is he talking about? So, and it took a while, and people then were left in a mix of confusion and desperation, I would say. There were some news ahead of his speech that people were already spreading the information that he will not actually talk about foreign policy, instead on domestic policy, and specifically addressing Germany, which is going for elections next weekend. So in this regard, you could also see the reactions later then from the Chancellor and even the federal president, who spoke right before JD Vance, already kind of anticipated what he might say. And the reactions were quite, so people were, you could see the big question marks in the room saying, okay, what does that mean actually for transatlantic partnership? So that was mainly the mood in the room when I was there.
So were people worried? Was there a sense perhaps that people thought that the Vice President and his boss are living in some sort of parallel universe?
Yeah, that's pretty much so. So my conclusion from this was, okay, so finally the domestic debate in the U.S. on freedom of speech, which he addressed, the question of religious, the question then of censorships, or all of a sudden had been brought on a global level, and all of a sudden, they realized, okay, this is not the classical transatlantic partnership, and definitely not the way as it used to be in Munich. So I'm going to the Munich Security Conference since 15 years, and we have never seen something like that. So we had seen Vice President Pence in Munich, and there were differences when we discussed foreign policy and security policy issues, but there was never ever a question that we might have different definitions when it comes to freedom of speech, democracy, what constitutes all these values we used to raise during these conversations, saying, okay, this is all a value-based partnership, the Transatlantic Commission, NATO, everything. So, and all of a sudden, so it's like someone is actually pulling the plug and saying, okay, so this is not any longer the basis actually in the terms of services we're operating on. So we have a complete different set. And as you said, so we have a different definition, which is completely offside from what anyone in Europe actually would define those terms.
Jessica, what was JD Vance doing with that speech? Was he speaking directly to the public back home? Did he totally misjudge the mood in the room, or did he genuinely mean what he said about Europe having an enemy within and those accusations of free speech being in retreat?
Anyone who was surprised by JD Vance's speech has clearly not been paying attention to Donald Trump and his team for the past 5 years. I have no idea how European leaders could come to the conclusion that JD Vance would come to Munich and suddenly be a different vice president than he's been on the campaign trail and in the White House for the past year. So his audience, first and foremost, as always, is domestic. Foreign relations are not the priority of the Trump administration. Their goal is to win for themselves, whatever that means, in whatever arena they are. So the hand-wringing and the shock and surprise we've seen coming out of Munich is really, for me, just indicative of the lack of preparation and strategic thoughts and action on the part of European leaders to prepare for what we knew was going to be a much more erratic second Trump administration. We saw what happened the first time round, and we've had plenty of time to prepare for an incoming administration that would have fewer guardrails and so-called adults in the room. So this should not have come to a surprise for anyone, and also it should not be a reason for panic. Trump always uses extreme statements to test the room, test the waters, see how people react. And then he adjusts his follow-up strategy accordingly. And by freaking out over these statements that were so shocking and surprising for the people in the room, they're actually showing their hand. They're showing weakness. And this will only inspire Trump and his team to keep pushing on without them and to think that they can push Europe into a corner, when what really needs to happen now is decisive action. They can turn the situation around by showing the Trump White House that Europe is, in fact, capable of standing up on its own soil and defending European peace and democracy.
Benjamin, do you agree with that? To what extent was Vance's speech intended, genuinely intended, as a wake-up call to Europe, a hard kick with Germany itself about to hold a major election? was he, as some have accused him of, meddling in his European allies' political affairs?
Well, I wouldn't go quite that far to say he's meddling, or even that he's trying to support the far right in Germany directly. I think the people like Vance are genuinely angry about the way the term misinformation has been weaponized in U.S. politics, and I think he's exporting that anger to Munich with this speech. And there's a lot of resentment, I think, built up behind it more broadly about the difference in values as he discussed with Europe. But I think the hypocrisy ought to be raised here. I mean, the Trump administration right now is engaged in a sort of multi-pronged attack on American democracy. And I don't say that lightly. I don't like alarmist terms, but, they're shutting down a federal prosecution of a presidential ally in New York City, which violates the history of DOJ and the sort of hands-off approach presidents have taken. They're illegally usurping congressional spending power, the power of the purse, in various ways. They're firing illegally, I think, inspectors generals in Washington who have an oversight capacity in the government. So the backsliding on democracy is taking place in Washington. I mean, JD Vance was right, I believe, to criticize Romania for shutting down an election over some Russian propaganda and TikTok videos. But he's working for a president who doesn't admit that he lost the 2020 election and tried to steal it. So the hypocrisy is so thick that it's hard for me to say anything else about it. It's kind of shocking to me. But clearly, I think it did have a domestic political audience first in mind. I mean, offending the overflow room, with all due respect to Olaf, is sort of, I think, at the Munich Security Conference, is a sort of intended outcome of Vance's speech.
Jessica, Olaf, I saw you both nodding vigorously there. Olaf, we'll come to you. Before we broaden the discussion out to transatlantic relations in the future more generally, I just want to ask you one more question about Vance's speech. Was that intended, do you think, as a rallying cry to the likes of Orban, Maloney, Le Pen, Germany's AfD?
Yes, exactly. So as Ben said, so this is important to understand. This was a connection between the domestic agenda, and I would call it the mission. Maybe even you can call it the crusade, because he was all these religious references he used in his speech are very, very unusual and unlikely for an European audience. So he gave his prayers at the very beginning to the victims of the attack we had seen in Munich the day before. So usually a statement, even the president actually would give his condolence. So and that was something actually you could see, okay, they, as Jessica said, so they're taking the agenda of the domestic politics, but they have an audience here. So it's not the people in the room, where the people actually he accused actually who had been excluded, like the German AfD party. So the chairman had excluded them because they were opposing peace talks with the Russians between the Ukrainians. But we have in all the 27 European governments or countries of the European Union, we have parties like who actually or which share very much the agenda of this administration in all the terms, and they would love to do the same with the democratic institutions, as what Benjamin just described as happening in DC. So they don't believe in democratic institutions. They don't believe in free, fair elections or in fact-checking. They call it censorship, but it's actually just the contextualizing of information. But they have a parallel truth they want to make people believe in, and this audience is growing. And so in this regard, I would say this was also a global call for actions for the like-minded in Europe, actually now to not to be scared by all this censorship, as they call it, and all these regulatory measures here, but actually taking the stage and taking the power and ruin the institutions as they are just demonstrating how it is in DC.
Jessica, I think we've already established this, but the EU's foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas, was right when she said that Vance was trying to pick a fight with Europe. Where will this lead transatlantic relations?
There's no need to pick a fight over this. As I said before, JD Vance didn't say anything we haven't heard him say before in other contexts. The European response here needs to be to parry this thrust. Don't overreact to the narratives of a breach in transatlantic relations. Stop hand-wringing. We need to recognize that ever since Russia's full-scale invasion, there has been this threat and divide. And ever since Trump indicated that he would have a second run at the White House, this threat has been on the table that a isolationist America could return. So we need to move with this moment and remind American Republicans who are pro-Trump but also deeply anti-Russia and anti-China that our defense relationship and our economic relationships are much more important than this current domestic political moment that the United States is in. There are a lot of folks in Washington right now who are wearing MAGA hats who still know who the enemy is. And by overreacting to extreme statements from the White House team, I think European leaders are missing the macro of what's going on here. We need to maintain those ties and to strategically offer the Trump administration wins, whether that's through trade deals or increased European defense spending. We need to start meeting some of the priorities the White House has demanded from Europe for a long time, and especially on defense spending, rightly so, to show that we're a serious partner. But if the only thing in response to JD Vance's speech that comes out of Europe is lectures and moralistic condemnation of his comments, then I think we will see an increase in this kind of rhetoric and also an increase in the bilateral communications between the White House and the Kremlin.
Ben, do you agree with that? I mean, the one thing that JD Vance did say in that speech that many European leaders cannot disagree with, because they've been saying it themselves, is that Europe must step up in a big way to provide for its own defense in the future.
Well, I don't think that the Trump administration cares that much if Europe steps up, or at least I don't think they should. My view is that the United States should do less to defend Europe, far less. And they should let the Europeans decide for themselves what they want to do in that event. I don't think the Russian threat is that big, contrary to a lot of what you hear. We see in Ukraine the Russian military sort of bogged down by a far weaker opponent. So, they're not coming for Poland. They're not coming for Western Europe. And the United States could safely do a lot less for Europe. And the Europeans can safely say, well, maybe we, want to continue spending a lot more on social welfare programs than defense. I think that's their right. And we don't have to tell them what to do. I think it's just important for the U.S. that we, reduce our own risks and costs, and while we're at it, try to get the Ukraine war settled. I think so. I'm very sympathetic to the Trump administration's agenda in that area. But I think that picking cultural fights with the Europeans, while it might be satisfying for Vance and Trump and even politically useful for them in some ways at home, isn't helpful to having a friendly but more distant relationship from a defense and military perspective.
Olaf, what do you make of that? Will the US, do you think, aggressively reduce its forces' presence in Europe during during Trump's term? What should Europe be doing now in terms of its own defense capabilities to support its support for Ukraine and the threat posed by Russia?
No, I think we definitely will see a reduction of the U.S. troops, and not just within the Trump term, but within the next 2 weeks. So that was actually what people were expecting from Vance's speech, and I think, as we just all agreed, so this was that disruptive moment he used to surprise the audience with something completely different, and distracting actually from the topics Europe should discuss. So this was, as I said, a wake-up call for the global or for the European right to raise up, but it was also a wake-up call for the Europeans, as Jessica rightly said, actually, to finally get their act together. And it was quite remarkable that the one actually who gave the best speech in terms of, okay, we need to beef up our defense spending and bring all these, so walk the talk actually, was President Zelensky. So he gave a speech actually in which everyone in this room or during the conference and all the floors actually agreed, okay, this is the kind of spirit other European European leaders within the European Union should have demonstrated on stage, saying, "Okay, this is now the moment." So we're talking about this for 20 years, and nothing has happened. So President Obama had said it in his very mildly friendly way. So President Biden has said it to the Europeans, and still nothing has happened. And all of a sudden, there was this kind of urgency you could feel in the conference floor, saying, "Okay, so maybe now we need to really do something." And yes, and not for the sake of remaining a good relationship to the US, but actually for our own interest, because so we don't know what Putin is up for, but at least actually, so the best way is to beef up what we are talking about for years now.
Jessica, on Wednesday, US Secretary of State Pete Hegseth poured cold water on the prospect of full liberation for Ukraine. And then we had this speech on Friday, JD Vance saying that US troops in Ukraine stay on the table if Russia doesn't negotiate in good faith. What are we to make of those apparently contradictory statements?
It's precisely how it seems, to keep Russia and Europe on their toes. The White House itself doesn't yet have an endgame strategy for this war. So they're testing messages, they're watching reactions, and also, as we know from the first Trump administration, President Trump himself can be quite erratic and change his mind on directions, on topics, based on more or less who was the last person in the room to give him advice. He goes with his gut sometimes. So the fact that American messaging in the past week has flip-flopped so dramatically is actually good news for Europe and should be a reminder that nothing is set in stone and that European action can still greatly influence the trajectory of the Trump administration's narratives and rhetoric. But by passively just reacting with statements, it gives Putin and the Kremlin much more opportunity to shape events. I don't think we need to read too much into the statements of this week, because everything at the end of the day will depend on what we do and not what is said. And last but not least, no matter what statements come out of the White House, they do not dictate what the Ukrainian government, military, and people will decide to do. Ukraine is a sovereign nation, a democracy, and their action in this war and how they determine to engage with Russia or maintain the fight will not be determined by a statement from the White House.
Benjamin, Moscow is putting more money into its military than the whole of non-Russian Europe is spending on defence, according to the International Institute for Strategic Studies. How does Europe get past the fact that it's been unable to reach a consensus on the threat that Russia poses and what should be done about it?
Well, one, I would like to check that statistic. I'm not sure. Russia was, last I checked, Russia was pretty far behind non-U.S. NATO on defense spending in total. But in real terms, that is inflation adjusted actual spending, not percentage of GDP. But, the bottom line is I think that the Europeans would be more unified against the Russian threat if the Russian threat were more clear to them. And I think it's as bad as the war in Ukraine has been, I think we're seeing real limits in Russian military capability there. And as much as we hear things to the contrary, there's not a lot of evidence that Russia's interested in some broader war, sort of trying to sweep into Western Europe like some Napoleonic power like Hitler or something like that. So it's, I think, clear to people who are being sober about it that the Russian threat is rather limited, and that's undermining the ability of Europeans to organize against it.
Olaf, I need a reasonably brief answer here, if you can give me one. Does Europe have the resources to protect itself without US assistance?
Yes, of course we have. So the thing is, we have a diversity of weapon systems, which is insane. So if we finally actually would agree on which country is covering which resources, we would be way more effective and impactful. So, but this is now actually for the Europeans to really talk serious amongst themselves. Okay.
Jessica, is NATO facing an existential threat? Should it perhaps be looking to open its doors to new members beyond Europe and North America if the US withdraws, I suppose, its financial assistance towards Europe, or at least waters it down? And how should NATO do that?
NATO is definitely facing an existential crisis. I think in the near term, what will be much more likely and effective will be for sub-coalitions of NATO members to agree quickly amongst themselves what kinds of strategic concrete actions can they take together. We've already seen a nascent Nordic, Baltic, Polish, British coalition start to form. They're in discussions about joint financing and setting common targets together because they understand the Russian threat very well. I think the idea of expanding internationally is definitely something that will be considered for the medium and long term. But as long as America is still a member of the alliance, any move to do so would be incredibly cumbersome. And I think first, NATO will be trying to handle with the tools that they have internally. And like I mentioned, having these sub-regional coalitions form on specific topics. But the message is clear that NATO needs to change and reform for the future.
And Jessica, when we spoke to you before the program, you said that an existential war for the future of Europe is underway right now. What did you mean by that?
Well, I disagree with our colleague in Washington about the level of the threat from Russia. What's not at risk here is Russian tanks rolling through Poland. It would be much more likely a combination of cyber attacks on critical infrastructure combined with targeted strikes via long-range missiles on critical European infrastructure. Russia has openly stated that they are looking to destroy the Western alliance, and in particular, to destroy the countries who joined the European Union and NATO after the end of the Cold War and escaped from Russian colonial subjugation. This desire to return to the past is not just theoretical. They are backing it up with guns and blood. And when I call that an existential threat, it's because it's precisely this. Europe at a turning point in the 21st century. We have had peace for almost 80 years now. Are we willing to put it at risk to appease a dictator and out of fear of the future? We have to find the same kind of courage that Europeans found in the 1930s and 40s. It took time to build consensus. It took time to get the Americans on board, but fascism was defeated in Europe. And we are now at a new turning point in European history where it's on us to recognize the threat and to behave with urgency and react.
And there, we must end it. Many thanks indeed to you all. Jessica Berlin, Benjamin Friedman, and Olaf Boehnke. Thanks for watching. You can see the programme again at any time by going to the website. That's at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, join us at our Facebook page. That's at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, you can join the conversation on X, our handle there at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian, Finighan, and the team here in Doha, we'll see you again. Bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.